have, this is usually my favorite part of a day like this, when we actually get to hear what's really going on as opposed to just speculating of what we think is going on. It's my belief that everything begins and ends with research. So actually this is going to be the middle of the day, but never mind. Beginning, middle, and end ends with research. And you know, we think that the statistics and the research that we're going to present to you now is going to help to particularly inform the discussions we're going to have in smaller sessions this afternoon, and then when we come back for the final plenary. We have two presentations. First by a dear friend of ours, Amanda Lenhart, Senior Research Specialist at the Pew Internet and American Life Project, who's been with us pretty much since the beginning when we launched FOSI, and I really appreciate you coming back today. And also Carly Shuler, who I think this is your first time at a FOSI event, a fellow at the Joan, Ganz, Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop. And they're quite different presentations, but also very, very informative. So without any further ado, Amanda, if you could take it over.
Thanks. Hello, hello. So it's great to be back here again, and I have to say I really enjoyed putting together this presentation because it gave me a real opportunity to dig back through the Pew Internet data from the past number of years and see what we had on mobile phones. It's also great, and I'll say this is because we're preparing to do a much larger piece of work on mobile phones over the next 8 to 10 months, and so this served as a great kind of groundwork for some of that work. So today I'm really just going to give an overview of what I discovered when digging through the Pew Internet data and share some of that with you. And again, as my role in these kinds of conversations always is to serve as both sort of a scene setter and a context layer. And I'll do that with a lot of data. And that's why I always use slides so that people can hear the numbers as well as see them. And these slides, I will make them available to folks on our website as well. So most of the data that I'm going to talk about today is from the last roughly 2 years, from two pieces of research we did in the fall of 2007, winter of 2008. Also some focus groups as well. And then there'll be a few points where I'll be talking about some data that's a tad older. But for the most part, we'll be focusing on this most recent work. So in talking about teenagers, what do they have? We talk about mobile phone use. What do teens really have, and how does it compare with all kinds of gizmos and gadgets that teens have at their disposal? Well, as you can see on this list, game consoles are actually the things that teens are most likely to own. Now, part of the issue here in this question that we asked is about the concept of ownership. Teens are more likely to own in families things like game consoles, personal devices like cell phones. Computers tend to be owned by the family at large or owned by parents, at least conceptually. Nevertheless, we think this is a reasonably decent read on kids' access to these kinds of, or personal access to these kinds of technologies. So 77% of teens have a game console. 74% have an iPod or MP3 player. 71% of teens, 12 to 17, own a cell phone, and as you'll see in a second, the breakdown does definitely lean much towards older teens. 60% have a desktop or laptop computer. And then here at the bottom, this is actually a piece that I think will increasingly become important. 55% have a portable gaming device, and this would be like a Nintendo DS or a Sony PSP. And I include those because increasingly these actually are communications devices as well as gaming devices. These are ways that kids are going online. This is in mobile ways. These are often sort of the gateway to cell phone ownership and to other kinds of mobile computing, particularly the DS, which skews quite young, is often owned by 7 and 8 and 9-year-olds. We'll talk a little bit more about this at the very end, but this is another place that I think we need to at least have our antenna up and paying attention to as we think about mobile devices, as we think about giving parents control of mobile devices, as we think about ways kids might be accessing and interacting with each other. So mobile phone ownership is growing. Big shocker here. The first time we asked about mobile in 2004, 45% of 12 to 17-year-olds had one. Now 71% have one, 63% in 2006, so it's a steady climb. Computer ownership, interestingly, has been quite stable over the past 2 to 4 years that we've been asking about it. Right around 60% of kids say that they have a computer. Parents also are much more likely to have mobile phones. then obviously then they're teens, but also then other adults. 75% of adults themselves have a mobile phone. 88% of parents have a mobile phone. And if you're interested in some of this dynamic between households, particularly parents and adult parents, and married households with children, we have an interesting report called The Networked Family, which also looks at some of those dynamics and gives you some even more deeper dive data into family composition and technology ownership. So I already made that point. So who has a mobile phone? Age is actually very important in determining who has a mobile phone, and there's a huge bump up at age 14. So when you break it out by actual specific ages, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, we see a large bump at 14. Some other data that I've seen that's not our data suggests that there's another bump at 12. So the sort of the general life transition moments when you move from elementary school to middle school, and then when you move from middle school to high school, are moments when you and your parents are likely to decide that it is time for you to have a mobile phone. So as you can see, 52% of the 12 to 13-year-olds have them, and then by the time you're 17, 84% of teens have some kind of mobile phone. There's interestingly no gender difference in ownership of mobile technologies. There's also no significant difference in mobile phone ownership by race and ethnicity. There's a little bit by socioeconomic status, but mostly that's a very small bump up in the very highest income brackets for a family. So wealthy families are slightly more likely to have cell phones. Their children are more likely to have cell phones. But for the most part, unlike computers, where we do still see not so much gender, but we see race and ethnic differences in uptake and ownership, mobile phones have really bypassed some of those inequalities and are really quite well distributed amongst various groups in this country. Also, internet users, again, not surprisingly, are more likely than non-users to have a cell phone, but 50% of non-users, and let's remember that non-users that we're talking about is 7% of kids. So 93% of kids are going online, 7% are not, but half of that 7% have a cell phone. So certainly there's dimensions to access that we're looking at. So with teenagers, I decided to go in and look at various kinds of phone use to give us some context as to what does it mean, what are we looking at, what are we thinking about when we're talking about mobile phones versus landline use, and how are we using it. So the first thing to note is that the most popular things that teens still do, and these are sort of, I've ever done this, I do this generally. 88% of teens are talking to their friends on a landline. That is still more than the number of teens overall who are talking with their friends on a cell phone. However, teens who have cell phones are even more likely to use them to talk to friends than teens, than sort of general teens. So what we're looking at with a 67% number is all teens, regardless of whether or not you have a cell phone. And the 94% number is whether or not is teens with a cell phone. Again, similarly, 58% of all teens have sent a text message regardless of whether they have a phone or not, which is important because text messages can actually be sent from desktops, can be sent from other kind of web interfaces. You don't necessarily have to have a cell phone to send a text message to somebody, but clearly it helps. As you can see, 76% of teens with a cell phone have actually themselves sent a text message. But I actually think this section down here is more instructive because this tells you what teens are really doing frequently, regularly, on a regular basis. And again, teens with cell phones are talking with their friends on a cell phone. Half of them are doing it every single day. So this isn't just sort of casual use of this technology. This is constant, consistent, persistent use of the technology. Interestingly, though, to contextualize this, 43% of teens are sending messages through online social networks daily. They're not sending email. 16% are sending email daily. They're actually replacing independent email programs with messaging through social networks. So nevertheless, mobile phones and mobile connectivity to friends by voice, and that's also important here, voice conversations, are still the most sort of desirable, most frequently executed kind of activity with teens. But 38% of teens are sending text messages on a daily basis. So we can see that the top of the top three daily things, 2 of them are things that you do mobily, things that you do with a piece of technology that is constantly with you. And as you can see, 29% are spending time with friends in person, 32% are talking on their landline every day. Instant messaging kind of on the wane as we have text messaging seems to be somewhat of a more instant way to reach people even when they're not at their computer with similar affordances of silence and privacy. So instant messaging is still used, but less often. particularly then text messaging and then voice applications. So I dug down and looked at voice a little bit more specifically as well. And girls are more likely to talk or to use voice applications than than boys are. And that doesn't matter what kind of phone it is, a landline or a cell phone. Age, of course, isn't a factor in landline use, which makes sense. It's generally with landlines, they're in the home, they're already paid for. Particularly if you're younger, you're more likely to be homebound and have a landline access. You're less likely to have a cell phone. But if you're older, the landline is there. It is also free to use, whereas in many cases your cell phone is not free to use. So that's not particularly surprising. I think these next 2 points really show the impact of frequency on use and age related to frequency and use. So older teens are more likely to use their cell phone to talk more frequently. Younger teens are less likely to talk on a daily basis with their cell phone. Now, it doesn't mean they're less likely to use it. It doesn't mean they're less likely to text. It just means that they're less likely to use it for voice calls. Also, interesting data point, suburban kids are a little less likely to talk on their cell phone every day, but there's no otherwise difference in cell phone ownership by whether you live in an urban area, a suburban area, or a rural area. Text messaging. So text messaging daily is up a lot since 2006. 2006, 27% of teens texted on a daily basis. 38% do now. Interesting also data point, 54% of social network users have sent texts or IM through a social network site. So important to keep in mind, again, it is not a mobile-only way of interacting with the world. Text messaging can be done from desktops and other applications. Girls are also more likely than boys to text. That's a big part of the girls are generally more likely to communicate than boys with others. So that's, again, not a particularly surprising finding. Also, older teens are more likely to text message than younger teens, which seems to go against Stephen's experiences with his daughter, but nevertheless, the N of 1 is different than the N of 1100. There's also no race or ethnic differences in texting. It's broadly across the spectrum. There's a slight bump up in frequency of texting by income. Again, that's not surprising given how plans are priced and how texting is priced. As many of you have probably noticed, the cost to send an individual text message has been rapidly increasing over the past couple of years, such that what was once a 2-cent, 3-cent, 5-cent experience to send or receive is now often a 10-cent, 25-cent experience or more. And so for teens whose families don't have the means to consistently afford large text plans, they may be reducing their text for actually talking, because talk still tends to be more of an all-you-can-eat style interaction with the phone. Twitter, I get asked about this a lot. Are teens twittering? I include this here because Twitter is often done mobilely. It's often done on cell phones, Blackberries, or iPhones. And they're not twittering. And I have a slide, the next slide will make this quite clear. But also we've noticed that they're still not going online with the phone. This is really changing a lot as iPhones, and particularly iTouch, not so much iPhones, but iTouches start to permeate down. iTouches you don't have to have, because it's not the phone, the cost isn't quite the same. It's a way to go online, but you don't have quite the same costs. I did a quick search 2 days ago to find out what's the bare minimum you could pay to get an iPhone in the DC area, and it's a minimum of approximately somewhere $75 a month pre-tax, which would be somewhere about $100 a month. And many families and many kids, particularly in this economy, cannot afford that. So really going online with the phone is a minimal, I'm going to download this ringtone and I'm going to stop. It is not a kind of all-you-can-eat super, similar as the way I'm surfing from my desktop. As again, I think this is changing as we see better applications, better technologies, and those technologies become more affordable, but that's not something that we've really seen recently. But anyway, back to Twitter. So this is actually not our data. This is from Comscore Media Metrics. Maybe some of you saw this. It was released on the 7th of April. And what this chart is showing is it's a little sometimes hard to interpret. So the orange line is the mean of the number of people, the average of people using Twitter. And so you read this chart by saying that persons 18 to 24 are 12% less likely than average to use Twitter. People who are 25 to 34 are 30% more likely than average to use Twitter. And so you can see here for persons 12 to 17, they are what, 41% less likely to be using Twitter than pretty much every other age group. So it's important to keep that in mind. This has really not hit this group yet. It very well may, but if you're thinking about things to be concerned about, Twitter is probably not where I would focus my attention right now. And finally, this is my last slide. Other mobile devices to think about. As I suggested at the very beginning, mobile gaming devices are another way that a lot of teens have access to content and to the internet and to others. They are owned predominantly by younger teens. 67% of 12 to 14-year-olds have some kind of portable game player. There's a big drop at age 14 when people either give them away or don't continue to upgrade them, don't have them, don't say that they have them, don't admit to having them. But boys are obviously more likely to own these than girls. There's, again, no difference by race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. These actually are really permeating through our society as well. And here's some of the things that they can do. So the PSP, which does tend to skew older, which is a bit more of a heavy sort of internet device, you can actually call with Skype on your PSP. You don't actually have to have a phone plan. You can just make it into an internet phone. You can also IM through Skype. You can get on the internet. You can access RSS feeds, all through your PSP, which I believe works off of Wi-Fi, but perhaps Anne or others might know more about exactly how that's functioning. The DS, even the DSi, which is the brand new one, still has that lovely thing called PictoChat, which is a way of sending images and words to other people within, I think they've now expanded the wireless network, but it's about 100 feet. And you can receive it from up to 16 different people. So anybody who's right around you can send these chat things to you, and it doesn't have to be, there's no authentication. It could be your best buddy who's sitting next door to you playing, Nintendogs, and it could be the guy who's sitting over in the corner of the coffee shop. So there's definitely interactivity there. There's wireless gaming, and there's also Wi-Fi gaming, and so it does connect you to the network. It does connect you to others. So again, thinking about these kinds of things when thinking about how children are accessing the internet, how children are connecting to each other mobily, wirelessly, we definitely need to have portable game players in there as well. And with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Carly, or I can take questions, or however you want to do it.
Roll right into Carly.
Roll right in. Great. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
And while Carly gets her slides up, I was pleased to see that my age group is in the vanguard for once, using Twitter.
Yes.
Although, again, my 13-year-old came to me last night and said, Dad, I need to get on Twitter. Everyone at school's on Twitter. So we may see we have one comment, quick question?
Twitter's terms of use are 18 and over.
Ah.
So we just need to be aware of that, and we're encouraging kids to go there and telling them the terms of use of that. And
Interesting.
do you have any stats on kids using their cell phones to make purchases? I know one of my clients is Stardoll, and the kids can use their cell phone to buy Star Dollars. That would be interesting to see if that's going to start to increase some of the subscription purchases.
Certainly. I mean, I know from some other colleagues, people I know who are based in Europe, that there is a whole industry around now buying things and having the cost show up on your monthly bill.
Yeah, the virtual goods.
But that is not, we have not asked about that, and I have no data.
Okay. All right. So if you didn't hear that, by the way, Twitter's terms of use, and I didn't realize this, thank you very much, because now I can say no. The terms of use are you have to be 18 and over. And I'd be interested to know how long that one lasts. But anyway, let's move right along now to Carly, and a very different approach and a very different perspective, which I think, will help to inform our discussion. So Carly, please.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Amanda. That was great. Hi, everyone. Before I dive in, I have to say I was so excited when Sammy got in touch and invited me to present some of our research today, for a number of reasons that go beyond following and keeping up with the really important work that FOSI and the Wireless Foundation are doing. And those reasons are twofold. First of all, younger kids have often been left out of the discussion when it comes to mobile. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's because people assume that these kids aren't using the devices, which is changing. And I think partially it's because there is less data available for these kids, which is also changing. But I'll talk a little bit about how they are using the devices, and even the ones who aren't, if we can start our education with younger kids before they start doing the things like sexting and cyberbullying, there's a really great opportunity there. The second reason I was so thrilled is a little bit more fun, and I think it's just that in this day, in this context that's all about safety, which is an important and serious topic, I have the fun job of talking a little bit about the positive potential of mobile devices for kids. So let me tell you a little bit about the organization that I'm with. And you can see a question up here. In 1969, a woman named Joan Ganz Cooney asked the question, how can emerging media help children learn? Well, the answer was a television show called Sesame Street. It's now almost 40 years later, and although the platforms and the mediums that children are using to consume messages are drastically different, the question really remains just as relevant. How can emerging media help children learn? So I'm from an organization called the Joan Ganz Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop. We're housed at Sesame Street, but we're an independent organization. We call ourselves a think and do tank, dedicated to understanding how digital media can help children learn in this digital environment, not related to the specific Sesame Street properties. So we do a number of things, and one of the things we do is research. And I'm here today to talk to you about our most recent report, which I researched and authored, called Pockets of Potential, Using Mobile Technologies to Promote Children's Learning. And it's a pretty big report, and you can download it on our website. I only have 15 minutes, so I'm just going to talk about some of the findings. But the report was based on interviews with over 30 experts from around the world who are directly involved in using mobile devices to help children learn. It analyzes what's going on. It has a really large appendix of projects, mobile learning projects from around the world. It identifies opportunities and challenges, and then it lays out an action plan to transform mobile learning into a force for educational impact. And I want to talk a little bit about why we decided to do this study in the first place. Pockets of Potential is our first report that's a deep dive into one specific sector of digital media. So why did we choose mobile when we're focused on preschool and elementary aged kids? Why did we choose mobile over virtual worlds, Club Penguin, over video games like the Wii? And the first reason it builds on what Amanda was talking about. We knew from the Pew data that teens are using this stuff so nearly ubiquitously. And so what's going on with the younger kids? We don't have any data on this ourselves, so this is data we gathered from other sources. Sesame Workshop and the Cooney Center will be releasing some data on kids in digital media in about 2 months. But what we found from other sources is that kids are using these mobile devices. According to NPD, mobile device ownership amongst kids aged 4 to 14 has experienced double-digit growth every year since 2005, making this the strongest growth category in consumer electronics for kids, beating out video games, beating out virtual worlds, beating out laptops and computers. Now, it's important to note that this data point includes devices like the DS, the ever-popular DS, and iPods and iTouches, but even though it's not all connected devices, this is kids' first exposure to living in a mobile world, and like I said, there's a real opportunity here to be using these devices to help them learn before they're doing the things we don't want them to be doing. A piece of Sesame Workshop data, almost all children in the US have access to a mobile phone. Not necessarily their own mobile phone, but 93% of 6 to 9-year-olds live in a home with a cell phone. And then this final bit of data I actually just got last night, so I'm sorry it's not presented in the most easy to read form. It's from, is anyone familiar with the Project Tomorrow Speak Up survey data that was released about a month ago? Their sample size was 300,000, so anyone who's in research, that sample size makes me want to cry. But some things to notice here. So this question, I couldn't really put it up because it was asked in an age-appropriate way to these different sectors. But the overarching goal was, which of these devices do you have access to and use? So it doesn't mean do you have your own, but it means you use on a pretty regular basis. Some of the things I found were interesting. Nearly 20% of children in kindergarten to 2nd grade use a cell phone or a smartphone, Now, that's not a huge number. It's not nearly half, But 20%, it's significant. And if you take that in conjunction with the first data point, which is that this is the fastest growing consumer electronics segment, young children are going to be using these phones. Sometimes they're secret phones, which I can talk about if anyone's interested after, but they're there. The other interesting thing here to really note is just as you go up, as grades 6 to 8, 64% of children in that age group have a cell phone. That's almost as high as the teen data. So these devices are really prevalent with younger children. Now, the second reason we wanted to do a deep dive into mobile for young children is that other major and important public sectors have shown really innovative advances in using these devices for social good. The first one I want to talk about is health. So there's an initiative in India called HIV and Freedom HIV/AIDS, and it uses mobile phone games to educate people about HIV and AIDS. And you probably can't see that middle text message there. It's just it's a message sent on a fairly old phone that does have a graphic screen. It says safe sex is the best sex, and it's a game. Now, how's that for sexting? How can we be using these devices that we're actually concerned about and using them as part of the education campaign? This initiative has reached over 40 million handsets in India. Banking, politics, these other sectors are really using mobile devices for social good. Citizen journalism, this is one I find really interesting because I think it really does apply to children. Anytime there's a mainstream event nowadays, the plane on the Hudson, the Mumbai attacks, the most intimate and up-to-date journalism comes from regular citizens, not from reporters. How can kids start documenting their days and documenting their lives? There's a huge opportunity here. So I don't have time to get into too many of the findings. What we really do is talk about the opportunities and the challenges that the people we interviewed see in this field and put together a fairly comprehensive list of mobile learning projects going on around the world. But I'm going to talk about some neat projects. The first opportunity with using these devices for children is to encourage anywhere, anytime learning. There is a huge gap. Children are instructed to turn off all of these devices that are so prevalent in their lives the minute they walk through the door to school. Now, that's important, and there's a lot of reasons that has to be done. On the other hand, it's making school just increasingly disconnected with the rest of their lives. Learning is best when it takes place on demand when the child wants it. It's called situated learning. Now, these devices have the opportunity to really promote that kind of learning like no other kind of device. So there's an example here. It's called HARP, Handheld Augmented Reality Games. It's run out of Harvard Ed School and MIT, and it's location-aware games. Most mobile devices are location-aware now. They use a technology like GPS to identify your real-world location. So if you think of somewhere like DC, everyone takes their 6th grade, class trip to DC. Imagine walking along the mall, and based on where you were, getting information about that building or about that location. Really, really powerful. The second opportunity is to reach underserved children, which is a little bit counterintuitive because people often say to us at the Cooney Center, the core of Sesame Street was always to reach underserved kids. But you're focused on digital media. Do underserved kids have this media? And what I really want to convey is that it doesn't have to be the location-aware device like I just talked about with HARP and walking along the mall. This project is one that we did called Learning Letters with Elmo, and it used regular cell phones. And how it worked was we delivered daily literacy tips to parents of preschoolers. So at a time that the parent wanted, the phone would ring, and it would be Maria from Sesame Street, and she would say, the letter of the day today is C. These are things you can do. Point out the couch, point out the car, point out the difference between a hard C and a soft C. Then, at a time also chosen by the parent, Elmo would call. So the phone would ring, the parent would be instructed to pass the phone back to the child, and Elmo would basically use Sesame Street content about the letter C and sing it to the child or show it to the child in fairly simple video. So this was, I'm not going to present the data on this, but it was hugely effective, particularly with lower income families. So great opportunity there. The second one, which I also the third opportunity, which I also love because it's a little counterintuitive, is to improve 21st century social interactions, namely communication and collaboration. And the reason I say this is counterintuitive is because I think there's a lot of concern about children using these devices in an insular way, texting and, really being involved with their device. But actually, mobile devices have been proven to encourage collaboration in ways that larger technologies like a laptop or a cell phone or a desktop computer do not. This is a really neat project, My Art Space, that's fairly prevalent in the UK. At most major museums in the UK, you can go in and sign up to get this cell phone. So it's always working. The program only works if you're there as part of a field trip. So every child gets their own mobile device, and as they go throughout the museum, they're encouraged to capture artifacts, so pictures or video clips or clips of themselves talking of things that interested them. Then they go back to their classroom, all the data is uploaded in a secure environment, and they make presentations about their experience at the museum. Pretty neat stuff. Fit with learning environments. Now, I don't know if there's any teachers in the room, but technology integration in schools has been a challenge, I think, for a number of reasons that we can't even begin to get into. But a lot of them have to do with just the physical. If you have a computer lab and you have a room of second graders and you have an hour and you have to get them all up, get them to the computer lab, sit them down, turn it on, the period's over before you've even had a chance to use the technology. And even if it all works well, you're so often teaching them about technology. It's typing class or it's computer class, but it's not really incorporating technology into learning in a really meaningful way, into your history lesson, into your math lesson. This is an example out of SRI, Stanford Research Institute, actually not affiliated with Stanford, I don't know, in California, but every child, it's a math lesson, it's a very simple software where the children work in a group to make fractions and trade pieces of pie to make a fraction. Really simple. And the last one, the opportunity to enable personalized learning experiences, is another example that comes out of Sesame Workshop, our home. And this is really neat. It's done on the iPod Touch, which Amanda talked about a little bit. And what happens is every child in the room gets an iPod Touch. And on that device, they take a Dibbles reading assessment, which is a really standardized reading assessment that will tell you, okay, let's say I took it, and it would notify that Carly is having problems with the silent E, let's say. That's my reading problem, one of my reading problems. I would then receive a personalized playlist of games and video content from the Sesame Street and Electric Company archives that's all about the silent E. So it's really reusing and repurposing 40 years of content in a 21st century kind of way. So those are just a few examples from the paper. I certainly encourage you to go on our website and take a look. And the paper concludes with a multi-sector, multi-step action plan about how to use these devices for the greater good. And I don't have time to go through it, but I just want to talk about this one element because I think it's most relevant to this audience, which is prepare. And I guess, if there's one thing that I could say is this whole paper was about potential. It's called Pockets of Potential. But none of that potential, these devices have the power to completely disrupt education. But none of it can happen unless we really wrap our heads around how to make them safe for children to use. So, the job that FOSI and the Wireless Foundation and everyone in this room is doing is important beyond just protecting kids. It's important in terms of unlocking the potential of these devices. And I just want to end with another quote from Mrs. Cooney, because I think that if you replace the word television show, it could be mobile devices. We don't pretend that media or a television show or a cell phone can solve the problems of our world, but we do believe it would be a terrible mistake not to use these most influential tools to contribute to the solutions. That's it. Thank you.
Stay here. Thanks. Amanda, do you want to come up? Thank you very, very much for that, Carly. I'm going to invite you to stay up here and join, and let Amanda join you as well. And let's take some questions and some comments. Yes. And microphones again? Do we still have microphones? Okay. Tell you what, just start bellowing, and then we'll get to you.
Linda Curl, look both ways. I really appreciate this because I was a researcher in mobile technologies for Microsoft and doing product
because most of the technologies, most people in the U.S. didn't have a mobile phone, and to watch how differently they use those phones, to watch how when the first camera phones came out, they were using these phones to snap the assignments off of whiteboards instead of writing it down. They just take a picture of what that was, or the collaboration work that they'd done, or when they would get on the trains, they'd snap, if it was going to a new place, the time schedules, and how they were actually using these in really positive and dynamic ways, and how tourists years and years ago could walk around Japan with a downloaded program helping them navigate the streets because you can't read the signs, or to learn about the culture. I mean, there's so many fantastic things, and I think we do need to look further abroad and look at the enormous progress, because the U.S. is a laggard in the mobile world, and really garner some of the fantastic education and learning opportunities that are being provided out there. And you know, when we teach kids to use tools as tools before we hand it to them to let them use it as a toy, they have a whole different sense of the responsibility and the opportunities for positive, rather than just, you know, going off in different ways. It's about education, but it's also about leveraging.
Either of you want to comment on that? Do you agree violently?
Yeah,
Totally agree.
Yeah, yeah.
We're in violent agreement, yes. If you could stand up and just let us know who you are.
My name is Matthew Vassar. I write for ArsTechnica.com. I had a question for either of you about platform interactive games like World of Warcraft or Guild Wars. What's the research on the extent to which kids are talking to each other on those games above and beyond the purpose of the game, which is to kill the monsters and get to the next platform? To what extent are they just, per se, communicating with each other like they communicate, say, on cell phones or other platforms like that?
I mean, I would say, again, this is an absence of any concrete data from us on this, or from others that I know of, but anecdotally what I hear is that, you know, that this is actually a huge part of why virtual worlds and why MMORPGs are so interesting. And we found that only about 20% of kids 12 to 17 are using MMORPGs, and about 10% are using virtual worlds. Virtual worlds tends to skew younger. MMORPGs tends to skew a bit older into boys. But as I understand it from other people who use those games, play those games, interact in those spaces, that the communication around the game that's not necessarily about the game is actually vital, and that's what keeps people coming back. These kind of sticky, I'm in this guild, I get to know these people, they become my friends, that's why I keep coming back night after night. Even in some cases with the virtual worlds aimed at children where they have limited the ways kids can communicate, they actually find workarounds so that they can actually communicate more. So some of them actually offer, you know, preset phrases that you can then share with other people, particularly if it's locked down. And the kids will actually take the phrase with the first letter of the word that they want to spell out, and we'll use that to spell out other messages by picking phrases with particular first letters to spell out something else. So they're working around some of the controls that we've even put on communication in those spaces, which leads me to believe that that's a huge and vital part of those spaces.
Carly?
Yeah.
You move closer to the microphone.
Sure. I think it's a great question, and I think there's actually a gap in the research considering how prevalent these devices are, these worlds are with younger kids. Webkinz, Club Penguin actually, is significantly more popular than World of Warcraft, and children aged 6 to 9 are the greatest users of virtual worlds, beating out your average, 22-year-old World of Warcraft player by quite, I don't know the numbers, but quite significantly. 6 to 9-year-olds are the greatest users of virtual worlds.
Yeah.
Webkinz,
Yeah.
Club Penguin,
Yeah.
those kind of sites.
20
Huge.
million.
5 million.
Yeah.
K0 in the UK just came out with a figure for kids in tweens and virtual world. If you look at k0.co.uk.
Yeah, I have a report here, actually, a report we released a while ago that I can talk to you about after. But the one thing I do want to say, I don't have any empirical data, but just anecdotally, what we're finding from some ethnographies and stuff is that kids do go into these environments and they do socialize, but they're combining their real world communication with their online communication. So let's say two kids live in the same household or in the same apartment building. They'll run across to each other, say, let's go to Club Penguin and meet in the library, go to the library, do something, communicate as best they can, using workarounds, not using workarounds, then run across and discuss what they did, or call each other and discuss what they did. So there's this whole muddling of communication types going on that's really fascinating.
Kim, and just to add to that, you know, BuildABear, I don't know if many of you have been to BuildABear, but you know, had a lot of birthday parties at BuildABear, and in the old days with my older daughter, we'd just go and make bears. Great, and everyone would go home. Now you go to BuildABear, you make bears, and then you go online because you now have an online bear that you can interact with, and it's mostly with amongst the friends, but then other bears do show up, and sometimes there are problems with other bears. Kim.
Personally believe, isn't that the perfect teaching moment for parents with their kids?
Totally.
If their kids are, my daughter's 5, we're on Webkinz, and I just told her about some, you know, being safe, about someone could take your password, and that's why there's safety things. And she said, they could give my stuffed animal the wrong food if they were, you know, pretending they were me. And that's just, I think, the perfect moment to introduce this whole safety element. But up until now, I feel like it's just been my experience that we try to start with the teens, tweens, and kind of ignore this younger generation. I just think it's a growing need that we should address.
Yeah, totally.
And you had a question? You should pass the microphone on.
To that really good previous question about talking in multiplayer games, and I just have anecdotal evidence too, but I heard this great story. I don't even know if this is on.
I heard this great story from a mom of a college student who he was going off to college. She thought, you know, he's leaving my life. I'm never going to get to really communicate with him again. But she knows that he loves World of Warcraft, and so she got into World of Warcraft, and now she is totally plugged into his life because they play together every Sunday. And he tells her about what's going on in his life that way, and in a way that she couldn't communicate with him in any other way, because he's not a particularly communicative kind of kid. So that, I just love that story. She's an educator and nonprofit person in Texas. The other anecdotal evidence is my own son's experience. He's on Xbox Live and really loves it. And there's some really interesting social norming skills developing because he's talking to kids who, you know, I check up on them, who are really pretty much his peer group, his own age. And they don't really talk about that much besides Halo, which you probably shouldn't be on, but I'm a bad parent. But anyway, they talk a little bit about like what state they're from. He's talked to kids in the UK, California. I live in Utah, East Coast, and that's about it. And we talk about how much detail you go into, but he's kind of developing sort of a leadership role in the game, which is kind of interesting, and because he sort of has negotiating skills and stuff. So it's an interesting thing to watch. Two great sources of information on virtual worlds is Virtual Worlds Management, which is like a trade show type firm in the US, and then there's K0 in the UK, providing numbers on that. And the only other thing I'd like to say is I think it's so important. I'm so grateful for the Cooney Center's research, because I think what it really demonstrates for us is that we need to change the discussion from safety from bad stuff to safety for. We live in a participatory culture and democracy, and we want kids to have full, healthy participation. And so we need to have them safe, psychologically, physically, reputationally, in every way, so that they can fully participate in an active global society. And if schools are afraid of litigation and parents are afraid of, you know, predators, then that whole discussion shuts down, and schools stay in the 19th century model that they're living in, and schools become more irrelevant, and we get further and further behind the rest of the world.
Great. Very good points. So, and that goes to our whole push to move from online safety to the discussion about digital citizenship. And we probably have to go via social media literacy to get there.